Okay, so I will start just begin proceedings now so that we've got plenty of time for the paper that we're all here to listen to. So thank you everybody for joining today's AVERT webinar. I'm from Kat Fuller, and thanks for joining us today, Kat. So the paper today is Detransition, Disinformation and Digital Moral Panic, the Politics of Anti-Trans Narratives. So I'm Associate Professor Helen Young. I work here at Deakin University, and I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, whose lands I'm privileged to live and work on. And I want to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to any Indigenous people who are here with us today. So as we begin proceedings, I just want to go through a couple of points for everybody. So we're going to have our paper from Kat, and then we will have some Q&A time at the end. Please, everybody, if you have questions, do put them in the Q&A, not in the chat. That should be available to you, and you're welcome to put those in during the session, or to consider or focus on listening, and then formulate your questions at the end. So we've got around sort of 35 to 40 minutes for Kat's paper, and then we'll have around 15 minutes for question time at the end. So as I said, thanks so much for joining us today, Kat. Kat Fuller is co-founder of the Canadian Institute for Far Right Studies, and currently a PhD student in sociology at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And thanks so much. If you'd like to start to share your screen and start us off, that would be great.
Okay, I'll start right now.
Please.
Okay, all right. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Just want to make sure. Okay, all right, so let's begin. So thank you everyone for coming. Um, so this is a paper that I'm working on, or it's in the process of being reviewed, so hopefully it get published this year. So let's begin. So this topic on detransitioning, it's been a topic that I've been interested in a long time, especially with the transphobic movements, anti-LGBT movement. But specifically, I've noticed this figure named Chloe Ko appearing in news media, or actually more specifically, right-wing media. So she's known for using statements like, I feel like a monster, or calling herself as a former trans kid. But I've noticed that she appeared in right-wing media like the Daily Wire, Fox News, or podcast series, especially from the Focus on Family and Jordan Peterson. But she gained her fame from suing medical providers for letting her transition under 18, as she argued that people should wait till they're 18 or older, even 25, to transition. But along with that, other than her media appearance, I've noticed that over 1,000 transphobic bills have been pushed in the United States from last year, and it's been growing over the years, especially from 2021. And I should mention that she became more, or she gained her fame in 2021, especially how many news outlets she had appeared through interviews, through media contents, anything like that. And she's also involved with an organization called Do No Harm as senior fellow, which I'll talk about that soon. So here's an example of what I've noticed about anti-trans bills. So, like I said, last year over 1,000 bills have been pushed, which is much higher compared to previous years, from 2024, 2023, and 2022, 2021, and especially much earlier years, how there were hardly any trans bills, or bills targeting against the trans community. So, especially, I think of why now, why recently. So that's part of my research interest. I think, why is there focus on gender affirmative care and trans people recently? And so, before I go further, I think it's necessary for us to understand, like, what is the anti-gender movement? So the anti-gender movement, the best way to describe it is that it's basically a movement against the LGBT plus community, or any movement that supports trans rights, anything that's trans exclusive feminism, as they frame it as what they call, quote, gender ideology, unquote. but this is often affiliated with moral panic, conspiracy theory, especially with LGBT grooming, conspiracy theory, cultural Marxism, anything like that. And there's definitely affiliation with far right wing organizations or figures like the Alliance Defending Freedom and the Heritage Foundation. And it's also worth noting that there are people identifying themselves as feminists or radical feminists, or specifically this term called gender critical feminism, where they argue that trans inclusive politics are supposedly harming cisgender women, what they call as sex-based rights. And then especially when I think of current events in the United States, this example here, I think of the movement against what they call is gender ideology or gender ideology extremism, or another term is the biological truth from the federal government from last year, especially on January 20th. I think about, again, why is there so much a focus on this topic, especially as they claim that they're trying to defend women's rights. Um, but along with that, I think of ongoing examples, even examples that just happened literally today, yesterday, regarding the trans community. So one of the examples I want to mention here very quickly, I think of the White House, how currently they're funding or pushing research on detrans regret narratives, and especially how they're removing legal rights for trans people to change their gender markers from their passports, along with Texas pushing its very first detransition clinic, as they claim that so many trans people, trans youth, are regretting their transition, which I'm going to talk about this soon. And then again, Texas, the Texas University, how they're banning materials, research, or even class discussion of anything to do with LGBT community topics, anything like that. And again, with this narrative, this also includes not just the supposed inner ideology, but how people are framing inclusiveness, feminism, or anything that's deemed as far left extremism. But the Trump administration are targeting what they call as anti-American or violent left-wing extremism through, again, what they call as gender ideology. And this also includes anarchism or Antifa. But what's interesting is that they're classifying this as a form of terrorism while removing right-wing terrorism in the category. And of course, there's more examples of heavy censorship of LGBT contents to the narrative of family value. So it's not just social media and books, but I've heard recently that the Trump administration is targeting television programs or any or media, mainstream media of what they believe is promoting gender ideology. So to clarify, a lot of people don't really understand what is detransitioning. It's very common for people to have a misleading idea, especially through a medical perspective. So to clarify, like I put this over here, it's people may, or I would describe this as a descriptive verb that refers to the act of returning in some way to a pre-transition state based on Hindenburg-Schum's article. But specifically, it has something to do about returning to a gender identity that somebody was assigned with at birth in some ways, or a pre-transition state. And that could be medical, social, legally. There's different forms of it. So an example I put over here, there have been cases of trans men identifying as a cisgender woman, but socially, but maybe medically, they still want to masculinize their body. Or another example, a trans man may stop taking hormone replacement therapy, but he still identify himself as a man. So there's a lot of ways of detransitioning, like whether it's medically, legally, or socially. But it's also important to understand that there's several factors as to why people detransition, especially if they're fearing for violence or if they're fearing of being attacked, harassment from family members, friends, or people who they fought with their friends, or coercion. I'm sorry, stuttering, or maybe their peer pressure forced into detransitioning, financial insecurity, maybe they don't have enough money to afford gender affirmative care, especially if they have medical concern, why they may detransition. And then along with non-binary identity, maybe they realize they're non-binary, maybe their gender is more fluid than they imagine. So again, there's often external reason, and it's very often because they're forced to detransitioning rather than that they regret or no longer identify as trans. And it's also important to note that you can still be trans and detransition, especially when I think of cases of people who retransition, trans people who detransition and go back transitioning. That's hardly ever discussed in this topic of detransitioning. So my research on Quo, I decided to focus on news coverages on the topic of detransitioning through Co. So my research questions I came up with from my article is how do news articles frame Coast experiences? How does Coast stance affect the medialized discourse? And what narratives do detrans people that disapprove of gender affirmative care invoke in news media? So, through a qualitative content analysis from May 15, 2023 to May 15, 2024, I've collected over 200 articles from this program called FACTA under the name Quo. I remove any articles that are duplicates or just completely unrelated to Quo, as there's another woman named Quo, but especially when I was reading the article and realized this is not the same Quo, or daybooks, which is just headlines. It led me to have 125 articles in total. What's also worth noting is that the timeline with that, again, going back to what I said earlier, with 2023 versus 2022 and 21, I've noticed there was a massive increase between 2023 and 2024. And again, I think about why the specific timeline. And then through coding, I've used this program called MaxQDA through inductive coding and along with grounded theory to find themes I could find through the news articles I've collected. And I also label the news articles as either left-leaning, right-leaning, center, based on the websites, programs I've used to determine whether or not they're more left-leaning, right-leaning, or center, which is basically Media Check, Ad Front, Media Chart. So here are the articles or news outlets I've collected. Um, I should mention UWire. UWire is a collection of news outlets from universities, um, especially since a lot of them are from Iowa, which is very interesting to see Iowa, the state of Iowa, showing up much more in my data collection. And the Daily Signal, which I'll explain later, this is a right-leaning article, the total of 28. So it definitely helps to capture to see the themes I've discovered with the news coverages in Quo. And I selected only English speaking countries to do a data analysis because I need to read them, and I unfortunately can't speak other languages very well except English. That's my native language. So this is a pie chart created based on the news articles I collected. So almost 50% or 46% are right leaning, 26% are left leaning, 8% are center, and then almost 20% or 19% are from universities. So it's very interesting to see the data collection in total. So here are the themes I've discovered after doing an analysis of these articles, which the first theme I've noticed is a partial perspective of detrans narratives, this narrative of protecting cisgender women and children, and the leftist trans agenda, and of course, lastly, the conservative connections I've noticed. So to explain each theme, here are the themes I've noticed so far um, regarding both Quo and detransitioning. So I've noticed it's very common for these news articles to not show a wider perspective or a more understand what detransitioning is or isn't. Only very few articles, which specifically is from New York Times, considered left-leaning, especially from this article called "How a Few Stories of Regret Fuel the Push to Restrict Gender Transition Care." But hardly any articles really discourse about what is detransitioning or how detrans people differ from each other, how they don't, not all of them express regret narratives like Co. Especially, again, from this article, they interview a few people who have detransitioned. As one person said, they detransitioned because of medical concern and their concern of safety in the Deep South, that definitely consider transitioning again. While another person discovered they're non-binary and going through financial hardship. But it's also worth mentioning that I've noticed right-wing articles like the Daily Mail, how they mention detrans people or interview them for their articles, but they don't show a wider perspective. So like the free detrans people they interviewed, two of them expressed very thoroughly that they regret their transition and that they're experiencing medical problems, health concern, or claiming that they got a trans occult. While one person they mentioned, Aaliyah Ishmael, which she has her own YouTube channel, she expressed very thoroughly in her accounts that she supports gender affirmative care. But even though they mentioned her, they didn't put that. They made it seem like as if she also support the narrative that gender affirmative care is supposedly harmful. So this is an example of how news articles can mislead the public like that. So the next thing I've noticed is the narrative of protecting cisgender women and children. So with public figures like Mike Johnson, House Speaker Mike Johnson, and fighting quote to the White House, claiming that youth are being quote unquote groomed by the LGBT plus community. but there's more sentimental wordings like protecting, vulnerable children, porn, sex radicals, social contamination. I've noticed though that right-wing articles tend to use more sentimental wordings like that, especially when they associate transness with autism, mental illness, and again that term social contamination. Another specific example I've noticed with Cole is an interview from the Telegraph back in 2023. The article titled, I was told transitioning would save me. It destroyed my life. As she noted that she discoursed how she believed that she would have not been able to transition if the providers addressed that she's autistic, has ADHD, and she pointed out how they didn't address that based on misinformation people have about autism. This is here. Oh no, she's too smart, too intelligent, too well spoken for her age for us to suspect she's on the spectrum. So it definitely helps to understand to see certain perspectives are being pushed, why people push autism, mental illness with transness. And also, there was definitely a focus of not just children supposedly being targeted, especially with arguments with social media, or the visible media appearance of trans people, but also there's been narrative of supposed lost motherhood or fertility concern with HRT. So it's very common to see news articles, especially right-wing articles, to use terms like butcher, mutilation, or Cole when she was interviewed expressing that she wanted to be a good woman. Which is noteworthy in one article I found. It's a fashion magazine, Women Wear Daily. They interview the founder of XXMXY, which is a sporting clothing brand, Jennifer Say, where she argued that her clothing brand is a movement against the trans exclusive politics, and she tried to compare it to the hashtag Me Too movement, as she believes that people are too scared to speak up. Which connects to the next theme I've noticed, leftist trans agenda. Literally all the right-wing articles I've found have supported this narrative that there's some supposed leftist trans agenda or trans ideology. So this includes narratives like cancel culture, like being silent, or calling Cole a brave activist against the supposed woke mob. The Daily Signal, which the Daily Signal is from the Heritage Foundation, they claim that LGBT organizations like GLAAD is a anti-Catholic or supporting anti-Catholic or supporting anti-religious stances. And this also includes narratives against the Southern Poverty Law Center, as they claim it's a scandal-plagued far-left smear factory. But again, this goes back to the narrative of like protecting women and children, especially since this is a quote from Jennifer Say, where she claims that people are too scared to speak the biological truth or being afraid of being called a bigot. And along with that, there's also misinformation being spread about HRT, again claiming that there's some sort of some sorry, some supposed trans leftist agenda. As there are articles claiming that HRT is only harmful against trans people, not cis people, but this is often associated to this term called transbroken arm syndrome, which is coined by Catherine Wall, which the term reflects how transness is often associated with mental disorder or physical disorder. So one example could be a trans patient expressing heart problems to a doctor, and instead of addressing the possible causes like lack of exercising, unhealthy diet, stress, the doctor concludes it must be HRT causing the heart problem. Or another example could be mental health problems, concluding that transness causes depression rather than vice versa. Or invasive questioning, where a medical provider asks questions that's completely irrelevant to the medical concern from trans patients. But this is often affiliated with that because it again reinforces the idea that being trans is some sort of disorder. And the next thing I've noticed is that there's often connections with conservative movements and figures. So, Do No Harm, for people who don't know, Do No Harm is an organization against gender affirmative care, but it's also focused on a narrative that progressive movements like affirmative action is supposedly harmful. Um, as there were articles noticing this connection, specifically the Associates Press, which has been labeled center. They noted facts about Do No Harm, especially the founder, Dr. Stanley Goldfarb, his background, where he's known for promoting against affirmative action, progressive movements. Like one example is his book that's literally titled "Take Two Aspirants and Call Me by My Pronouns: Why Turning Doctors into Social Justice Warriors is Destroying American Medicine." So again, going back to the narrative of this supposed cancel culture, Um, it's also worth noting that a lot of figures behind this who support Cole's stance protests is not just Mike Johnson, but other right-wing politicians who are pushing this narrative that detransitioning is rampant and that trans people are targeted or harmed by this supposed agenda. Um, so to give a summary of what I've noticed or discussion about my article, and I put a little video over here just for humor. So this term ideological entrepreneur, which is found from one of the articles I've used for my research, basically that term reflects how media figures like Cole have used themselves to promote a certain belief idea, or as it's quote over here from another article. Oh, that's by accident. Oh, that was by accident. I don't know what happened. Sorry about that. Okay. So it's titled over here, a convincing image of a relationship between specific injustice perceived by various groups in larger system, which the intellectual entrepreneurs decide alter. So specific example would be Alex Jones with his radio show that he used to have called Infowars. We know Alex Jones for using conspiracy theories, fear, and right wing politics for his brand. So that's an example how someone uses their media appearance or celebrity status to promote an idea. And again, this is an explanation why I use this video. This is also part of the narrative of Think for the Children. It's common for politicians, especially with news media coverages on missing children, which I'll explain about that soon, where where politicians, especially through media, use the appeal of emotions or false sympathy to create like a moral panic or a certain narrative to support certain policies. So, like one example is politicians pushing a law that would require age verification in social media. Again, this has also been nicknamed the Lovejoy's Law because of the Simpsons, where Helen Lovejoy, the wife of one of the main characters of The Simpsons, Tim Lovejoy, where she's known for saying, "Won't somebody please think of the children?" But all of this is part of weaponizing a trauma narrative from detrans people, especially through the idea that this would supposedly help or prevent this alleged danger from gender affirmative care. But this is also seen from anti-sex work laws, where people promote the idea that arresting sex workers or pushing anti-sex laws would stop human trafficking altogether, which doesn't. There's been studies reporting how it doesn't effectively help sex workers who are victims of human trafficking. But this also goes go back to cultural narratives that people are telling themselves. So to explain all this, I focus on the radicalization to fascism, or the narrative that connects right-wing fascism. So moral panic. So I think about how fear has been used as a form of a weapon, especially to push political narratives. Specifically, Stanley Cohen in his book Folks Devil. For people who don't know, the term Folks Devil means how a group of people, often marginalized, are used to blame or become scapegoats for societal problems, especially in cases like Dungeons and Dragons, where people claim that it's causing youth to worship the devil or do immoral acts. Or a well-known example would be the Salem witch trial. But there are definitely several examples where marginalized community, especially with racial, like Black Indigenous people of color, have been targeted as folks devil, scapegoat into moral panic. Um, so again, this is an article I've used for my paper. Joel Bess, his research on missing children in news media. So the summary of that article is basically how news media coverages cover on missing children, but framing it as a strange reduction rather than understanding that there's several reasons how a child may go missing, whether it's short time, are they running away from home, or are they kidnapped by a family member instead of a stranger. But part of it is using sensational headlines where it grabs people's attention, thinking, "Oh no, my child might be in danger," and it gets people's attention more. So it's part of the appeal of emotion. And oh, I should mention the book cover I put over here, The Lavender Scare. That's also another example of moral panic because part of it is the connection of the Cold War or the fear of communism in the United States, where gay men and lesbians have been targeted because the conspiracy theory that they may work for the Soviet Union government. Um, but I want to mention that. So another thing that's worth exploring is the ecosystem disinformation, especially through narratives of common sense versus freedom of speech. So the term intellectual dark web that was coined by Eric Weinstein, which he's a mathematician, podcaster. But that term has been used around public figures who are seen as intellectuals or public intellectuals, like Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, Sam Harris, and Douglas Murray. But basically, this goes back to the term cancel culture, woke mob, claiming that they're victims of wokeism or they're being silenced for free speech. But this is part of it is creating a pipeline because it's not understanding about why people are criticizing their beliefs. It's just framing it as controversial rather than that it's just simply wrong. So, like one example can be supporting eugenics or scientific racism. It's strongly criticized. It's not supported, not because it's controversial. It's just it's completely wrong. It's pseudoscience, really. But also this kind of creates a pipeline through what people may believe themselves as centrist, apolitical, or even liberal to a more right-wing pipeline or a pipeline to a right-wing ideology. But part of it is not understanding complex social problems, as people may frame this as both sides are bad, but not understanding like what do they mean by both sides? What is the both side? What side does it mean to be left versus right? But again, this is part of simplification. Like one example that I want to mention here is the term TERF, trans-exclusive radical feminists versus liberal feminists. Um, they may tie together against their beliefs against trans women, but they may differ on economic status. They may differ in other political beliefs, especially since I think of the definition of radical feminists, how that differs from liberal feminists. Especially in more extreme cases where people may say that they identify themselves as political lesbians versus people who don't. But again, it's understanding the different ideologies people may identify themselves as. Um, it's also worth noting that the history of this narrative that transness is a mental disorder or some sort of disorder. So the pseudoscience and transphobia. So it's a little joke. I put Jurassic Clark for a reason. So the Clark Institute of Psychiatry has been nicknamed Jurassic Clark, which it's also worth noting that it's now known as the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. But um, but they have been so a lot of people have criticized the institution, especially regarding conversion therapy. Ashley Florence, she talked about, I mean, they talk about this in their book, Banning Transgender Conversion Therapy Practice, especially research where terms like rapid onset gender dysphoria, it's um, the criticism against that, which that term rapid onset gender dysphoria that was coined by Lisa Littman in her study about parents of trans youth. But a lot of people have criticized the research because of the methodology and data collection, how it doesn't make any sense, especially interviewing the parents instead of the children themselves or the adult children, understanding their perspective, which I'll talk about that soon. But this is basically the idea of the social contamination, especially since other people like Kenneth Sucker and Hillary Case, how they use the term social contamination regarding rapid onset gender dysphoria. And another term, autogenophilia, that was coined by Ray Branchard, which is the idea that trans women are transitioning for a sexual purpose. Again, very misleading, but other scholars have used that narrative, especially in this case, J. Michael Bailey in his book, The Man Who Would Be Queen. But a part of it is creating a pseudoscientific social network of misinformation, disinformation, especially through gender sensualism, um, where people push the narrative that there's a female brain or that people are that different from each other through what they call as biological sex, biological reality, especially again with eugenics or discipline like the evolutionary psychology or positivism, trying to predict people's behavior or trying to predict people's behavior through science or specifically going back to the term rapid onset gender dysphoria, it takes the science into transness by saying, oh, well, these youth may not be trans because maybe they're traumatized or maybe they're influenced by people like social media, school, their friends. Um, this has been noted with the ex-gay movement, especially with narratives that they push within that movement where they believe everybody's supposed to be cisgender, heterosexual, or the term cis heteronormativity by nature. But again, this is part of pathologizing queerness. So again, this is an example how people frame gender dysphoria as some sort of disorder or associating it as a cause or the outcome of a disorder, like autism, borderline personality disorder, self-hatred, not fitting in, depression, anxiety. It's very interesting to see several examples or trying to be interesting, be different, or anything like that. Internalized homophobia, misogyny is another example But again, it helps understand why this argument of rapid onset dysphoria doesn't make any sense. Um, so with theories, I think of Judith Butler, especially in their book on Who's Afraid of Gender, that was published in 2024. The term they discourse is fatalism, or I'm mispronouncing it. I know I'm mispronouncing it. Fatalism, which is basically the fear mongering or scapegoat around um, gender move or trans people or anything to do with LGBT plus community, feminism. But part of it is scapegoating that anxiety, blaming it for social decline or moral indecency or degeneracy. This is where the term groomer comes in, especially with people not understanding how these movements came to be. And this is also related to a term called objection by Julia Kristova in her book Powers of Horror, which is the subconscious disgust between the blurred line between self and other, or in this case, cisness and transness. So part of the detrans narrative is that people are or part of this discourse, especially with trans people appearing existing in media. It's part of it is not understanding the complexity of human nature, especially if the fear of, oh, like maybe people are not as dualistic as they are. So based on that fear, not understanding how people may be much more complex than we imagine. So again, going back to the idea that female brain, male brain exists, or that there's sex equals gender, it's part of a discourse and understanding why that doesn't make any sense. And so this is also related to Roger Griffin's in his book Fascism, Revolutionary Ultra Nationalism. But basically, it's the false memory of the past, especially with the other term collective amnesia, where it's not understanding the past to the present or a historical understanding. So again, this is part of not understanding how transness is not a new relative, a new recent event. It's been going on for centuries in other countries through time and culture, especially when you look at indigenous culture. But this is also related to Butler's term that they coined heterosexual matrix, where part of it is that people want to oversimplify identity. So this is where people think if you're male, you must be masculine. If you're male and masculine, you must be heterosexual, instead of understanding again that people are very complex. And this is also related to the fourth function of hate. So there's playful hate, which people use ironic racism or humor through hate, which normalizes what he described as passive nihilism versus radical, or um, turning people to passive nihilism to radical, meaning that they become indifferent to the world, to hating the world. Another term or another form of hate is friendly hate, where people are socialized through hate through a community culture. So, like newsletters and alternative social media apps is an example because it becomes very normal. It becomes a social bond, really. Another type of hate, righteous hate, where the lore of conspiracy theory, especially through the us versus mentality, comes in, and that's from online discussions or Socrates, or part of the method is just asking questions rather than actually engaging with the answer to these questions or a more intellectual understanding of their argument. And lastly, patriotic hate, which is often related to white hate or white rage. But part of it is the emotionality and collective memory of the past, especially when they feel like they're being under attack and not understand where this hatred, this anger is coming from perfect progressive changes. So this is where people say, "Oh, this is cultural Marxism. This is wokeism. It must be a new movement attacking my life, which is objective. There's nothing wrong with my life," but not understanding why people criticize saying what they deem as normal. So to give a summary about the far right wing violent attacks in the United States, I think of the Proud. So one example that comes to my mind immediately is the Proud Boys, especially when I think of how the Proud Boys has been classified as a terrorist organization in Canada, but not in the United States, and how they're targeting drag queen story hours in public events, the library, as they claim that they're attacking children, and especially how they're involved with January 6th Capitol riots. And this also includes children's hospitals being attacked through these narratives, especially from social media influencers or media figures like libs of TikTok claiming that they're giving free surgeries or performing surgeries on children. This has led bomb attacks, harassment, especially with educators from elementary school to university. Again, part of the narrative, their supposed cultural Marxism. And then suicide hate crimes have risen over the years, as over 40% of trans adults have attempted suicide. And it's definitely a lot worse in anti trans laws in states. of and along with hate crimes, where 2.5 incidents are occurring every day in the United States. So, to give a brief summary, is that with my research, I think about how we need further research about detrans, how people are misframing narratives around that. But part of it is a moral panic, and how that framing of moral panic has been used in not just mainstream media and alternative media, but just how we're discoursing through through communities, how we're understanding personally. Um, and that's pretty much all I can say from here. So thank you everyone for attending. Here's my email and my website if anybody wants to contact me or have any questions. Thank you. Let me just okay.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Kat, for a really helpful account of what is actually meant by transitioning, um, and how that's increasingly leveraged in kind of radicalization pathways. So, folks, can you please remember to, as you formulate your questions, to pop those into the Q&A. Um, and while you're doing that, I just want to start with a question, Kat. If you can talk a little bit more about how far right how far right networks are levering these transition narratives, um, kind of in their ideological mobilization. What are they actually doing with these? So you talked a little about the ways that kind of violence is being focused there towards the end. But is there anything
Oh,
more you can say around that leveraging by extremists?
yeah, so part of it is part of it is association with other narratives. So like it's very common for far right figures to say, oh, like these LGBT figures are promoting pornography. They're importing immoral acts against children. Or part of it is not understanding like where this narrative of queerness, where people associate that with mental disorders or violent or other acts. Like one example that comes to my mind, I think it's very common, or part of it is movements where, like in countries like Uganda or other countries, where they say, oh, like the LGBT are targeting children, they're doing all these harmful acts, and it's part of not understanding like what is queerness, what does that really mean. But especially when I think of media figures where they target certain individuals and spread that misinformation, saying, "Oh, look, see, this person is giving out medicine to children, or is sorry, I'm stuttering, where they create this false narrative saying that they're selling drugs to children, especially when it's not true at all. They may be just saying, hey, there's a way to contact this doctor. Here's the informative content doctors you can go to through this map. But somebody can make this information up and say, no, they're targeting children. They're doing this. And part of it is a parasocial relationship with far right media figures, where people may, like, part of the radicalization is that they may have not understand, and they may say, oh, this person gets to me or gets me. I feel like this is my friend, like subconsciously. And so it's kind of like a build of trust where they think this person knows what they're talking about, especially when they think this is part of common sense. And instead of like understanding the other perspective, or understanding about like why are people discoursing about gender like this, or why is there different ideas versus traditional understanding, it's listening to a community of people that they deem is more like, what's the word I'm looking for? Like part of it is that it's part of like the anti-intellectualism, especially when they frame scholars, gender scholars, as these out of touch eggheads who don't know what they're talking about. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Um, so would you characterize what's happening there as a kind of scapegoating um, of both trans people, but also um, doctors, people who are supportive of trans communities?
Like I mean, I want to make sure if I understand your question. So like scapegoating like doctors, like anybody involved like active or allyship, like
Right, kind of right-wing figures saying, there are all these problems for children that are being caused by this group of people.
yeah, like part of it, like what comes to my mind immediately, I think about like the misinformation about vaccines, where they say like, oh, like we don't need vaccines, like this is probably propaganda. These doctors are just trying to get your money, and especially when a lot of people are distrustful towards doctors, or have negative
Mhm.
experiences, or have to pay health insurance in the United States, so or negative experience with doctors in general. So part of it is like again, part of that is not understanding what's going on, like how come the healthcare system is so different in the United States, or why is it that there's more societal issues, like not just healthcare, but also education or capitalism itself. But part of it is kind of like a narrative where right-wing figures say, "Oh, that's the problem. If we just get rid of these doctors who are promoting this idea, we wouldn't have this in the first place." Or anybody supporting what they believe is a wokeism.
Okay, and you touched a little on the kind of role the Trump administration is playing. Is there anything more you can say there about what's kind of happening there to amplify and legitimize these narratives,
Yeah, so
particularly in the kind of mainstream political discourse?
yeah, because part of it, like when people have heard these narratives before he was elected, and then after it's kind of like creating like legitimacy where they say, oh well, if the government is pushing this, it must be true because part of it, especially in what ways where if we part of it is removing ways where people can understand it. So like Texas, when they remove discussion, it prevents people from truly understanding. It prevents like a way where they can have like more of an understanding of why these movements occur. So, like, one example that comes to my mind, I think about why so many people didn't understand the differences of trans versus gay, or understanding that trans is not a mental disorder, or this discord. Universities definitely can help people to understand, especially through class discussions or having people sharing their experiences. But part of it is dehumanizing people, especially with propaganda, visual propaganda. Like one example that comes to my mind, I think of AI being used in social media where they promote this idea that these people are so different and that they're not like who they deem as the normal people, the normal US citizen. So it's definitely part of it. Like part of it is just normalizing through culture and politics, really,
Mhm.
especially again through laws and social media.
Okay. So you've given us a good kind of overview of what some of the challenges are, what kind of the issues that there are around these kind of anti-trans narratives, around the connections to radicalization, to extremism, and kind of extremist positions. So we've got a question here, about what practical steps can be taken to combat this kind of radicalization pipeline that you're describing, from stigmatization of LGBT people in general and trans people specifically, through to recruitment into far right extremism. What are the ways or the kind of practical steps or the strategies for resisting this kind of anti-trans extremism?
Yeah. So what I propose, because I think about like states here in the United States where we have the upcoming midterm election, especially in what ways people advocate through laws we have in states. So especially in ways where I think of why social media, why it's crucial for us to have access to certain information. So like one example that comes to my mind, I think about how states like California differ so dramatically from Texas, especially through not just through the politics but also the culture. So part of it is just like part of it is actively engaging a public, or part of it is public sociology or sharing that knowledge to the public. And that could be a lot of ways. It could be through public events, it could be through schools, especially in what ways where we try to connect people, the connection between one aspect versus another. And part of it is pre-debunking. So like pre-debunking, like debunking, but you're preventing the misinformation being spread. Like so part of it is like asking questions like, hey, like why do people frame it this way? Or how come we say that women act so differently? Where's
Mhm.
that all coming from? Especially like one example that comes to my mind, I think of misinformation or disinformation being spread about reproductive care, where people say, "Oh, you don't need this," but they're not understanding like why do we need certain acts, like especially education, or what does it mean to prevent pregnancy or prevent STD. But I think in what ways people resist that, especially through ways where it could be through mailing or ways that's more creative. But it's definitely, I mean, it's something that I think about a lot because I think what could we do, especially what's going on right now in the United States, and it's just it gets to a point where it seems I would definitely say it's much more challenging, but I've definitely seen ways where people are willing to do what they have to do to spread that information and to buck disinformation. But that's the best way to put it in a
Mhm.
summary.
Okay, so really kind of thinking about the information, or kind of education correcting, um, and working against some of those kind of narratives, um, that are underpinned by false claims.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Um, okay. I wonder, we've also got a question here. So this kind of detransition discourse, can that be connected to earlier movements like the ex-gay movement, conversion therapy, some of these things that have been around for quite a long time that have also been reasonably substantial part of extremist narratives, whether that's right-wing extremism, whether that's particular kinds of religious extremism. Um, are
Yeah,
there,
so oh,
please?
oh, sorry. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah.
But, okay, yeah. So, part of it, what I've noticed is that with the framing around the XK movement, they say like what's known as a testimony politics, where they share their experiences and say, "Oh, I was going through a really hard moment," and they still say deviant acts like drinking and doing drugs. They'll say, "Oh, I was doing this, I was doing drugs, and I was harming my body and myself, and I was unhappy." And then something occurred, whether it's finding religion, like becoming a born again Christian, and saying how that changed their lives dramatically, or find the science and say, oh, like it was because I was so traumatized by my father. This is why I acted out this way. And it's interesting because I've noticed with the ex-gay movement, some of them have used the science where they say, oh, we'll find the cause of it, like through talk therapy. Like talk therapy is definitely one example where they say, oh, the reason why you're attracted to this gender is because your dad did this, or you didn't feel like you're normal, or something along the line. And there were certain methods of use, like especially one method is aversion therapy, where they use physical pain or chemicals that would make somebody regurgitate through, especially if they're showing images, graphic images. Part of it is traumatizing the person or associate trauma with attraction. And another method also is electricity therapy, where they electrocute people to repress these feelings. But there's several methods they've used. But what I've noticed the similarity with the transphobic detrans narrative and XK movement is that it's the idea that everyone's supposed to be cisgender and heterosexual, rather than understanding why, like how come everybody has to be, especially through procreation, where they say, "Oh, your purpose, you're supposed to have children, a nuclear family," and not understand like, well, why should everybody have children or be a nuclear family, or these gender roles saying that you're supposed to be this way, without understanding what does that mean to be normal. Again, with pathologizing queerness, this goes back way back. Like one of the things that comes to my mind, I think of Sigmund Freud, where he says it's arrested development. Claiming that being heterosexual is full development. And I think in what ways where people took that narrative and say, oh, this is the outcome of why you're not normal. And so, again, when I think of movements like with detransitioning, it's gender. There's this one therapy act or conversion therapy act called gender exploratory therapy, where they try to talk you out and say, oh, yeah, you're experiencing gender dysphoria because you don't feel like you're pretty enough, or this happened, an eating disorder. Again, rapid onset gender dysphoria. And then there was something I was going to say about the XK movement, but oh, another one too, which is worth noting, is repression and identity. So for people part of the XK movement versus the XXK, people who no longer are part of the movement, there's actually a term called the middle way, where they're not exactly XK. They admit it. They're not saying like I no longer practice the lifestyle. They say I still feel this way, but they use methods where they're trying to repress it. So that could be celibacy, or finding ways where they're not acknowledging feeling what they experience through repression, or identity, where they may say, oh, I'm a Christian first. That's the foremost identity. I'm a Christian, rather than what they're actually feeling, identifying, or coming in terms with it. And I notice a similarity with transphobic detrans narratives, where they say, I experience gender dysphoria, but I repress it by being more feminine, or finding the cause, or doing X, Y, and Z. So, I mean, that's basically the summary of what I've noticed so far with the similarities with X gay movement and transphobic narratives. So.
Okay. Um, can you talk a little bit about why you think that that the kind of anti-trans movement is, or anti-trans ideology is, it's a kind of connection point or a common point really across different ideologies on the far right. So it's part of Christian nationalism. You know, you mentioned the Proud Boys. Um, the Nazis and neo-Nazis are certainly anti-trans, anti-queer. Um, what is it about trans people specifically, or queer people more generally, that makes that common ideological focus, I guess?
I would say that part of it, because I think about how historically trans people have always seen like it's the other, and I think, especially when I think of media, how they normalize transphobia through jokes, like especially through movies where they use trans women, trans men's punchlines, and I think part of it was that as more trans people became visible through social media, especially through movements, like I think of the existence of Facebook, Tumblr, how it allowed people to form these movements or to speak out against the injustice. But part of that visibility increasing, part of it is letting people know that not only they exist, but how do other people react negatively. So along that increase, part of his movements against that, where they say, "Oh, like what's wrong with these people?" So like, I think of Tumblr as an example. I think of how the far right have stigmatized Tumblr as a woke mob, or I mean a woke media. That's one example. So it's kind of like a cultural battle in some ways, but part of it too is really how people are not understanding about transness. So like, again, going back to the stigma of trans, or the stigma of being LGBT plus, part of it is because it's been so normalized in society in ways. It's kind of like, how do people take that when it's been normalized through years, especially when you get other marginalized community like feminism or Black initiatives, people of color, Black Lives Matter, how that's been stigmatized, or especially hegemonic narratives being challenged. So I mean, but I would definitely say overall, social media is like part of that narrative where it's being pushed, especially again where people don't understand, um, like why people are speaking out now. Hopefully that made sense. Again,
Mhm.
there's so much I could say about that alone.
Right. Okay. So, and yeah, one of those kind of, I guess, very public topics of debate is around um, the difference between sex and gender. So you have a figure like J.K. Rowling who's
Yeah.
um, kind of making quite strong pronouncements in that kind of space.
Yeah, yeah. Because one of the things that comes to my mind, because I think of these figures who normalize it, it's like Rowling coming out saying like, "I'm supporting women's rights, and this is not okay." For people who don't really know any better, they don't really understand, or have, or didn't do research or and connect with trans people, like actually speaking to them, or understanding like the whole narrative about this, they may listen to her and say like, "Oh, this is what I feel too. I think this is very weird. What is this going on?" And so you have public figures like Rowling, and also not just her, but even other people I've heard of where they're not far right, they may not identify as feminists, but they may identify as liberal and say like, "Oh, this is so weird. Like, what's up with these trans people existing?" So, like, I think of comedians like Dave Chappelle that in some ways like normalize transphobic humor, where it's kind of like a way to, instead of stigmatizing transphobia, it normalizes destigmatize it further through these jokes. But that's definitely part of it.
Okay. Um, Look, thanks so much for your time, Kat. We really appreciate you yeah, taking that time to talk to us about the connections between the anti-trans kind of news coverage and the ways that this is leveraged as part of radicalization and extremism. Um, so a couple of things for everybody in the room. Thanks for joining us today for this AVERT seminar. Um, do remember that you can follow us on AVERT on LinkedIn to keep track of what seminars are upcoming and our other events. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel where a version of all our where videos of all our previous webinars are up and where this one will be up in a little while. And you also can join the AVERT mailing list to help keep track of all our different events and opportunities. Um, so thanks very much again, Kat. It's been a real pleasure to have you and to hear from you.
Same here.
Thanks, everyone.
Um, thank you.